Hello everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things and chatter about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today we continue our tour of European Merfolk mythology. We're going to focus mostly on Northern Europe, so get yourself a drink, settle in, this might be a long one folks. Before I start, I do want to mention this topic was chosen by my Everwise patrons, whose ranks you can join for as little as $1 a month by clicking on the link in the description below. If you'd rather leave a one-time donation, I appreciate that. There's also a link to my Ko-fi site. And if you do leave a donation, feel free to leave a request as well. Now, with all that out of the way, let's continue our quest to reach the bottom of the endless pool that is Merfolk lore. So we're going to start in the Netherlands with the story of the entangled mermaid. According to the story, mermaids live in family groups in the marshes and pools that form at the mouth of rivers when they meet the sea. Here, they enjoy the mix of salt and fresh water and take on the role of maintaining the ecology of the pools and marshes, keeping the wildlife in balance, looking after plants, keeping out intrusive species, that sort of thing. That said, there was still plenty of time for leisure and fun, with the story noting that merfolks threw grand parties every full moon. Well, unfortunately for one merfolk family, the people of the Netherlands, completely unaware that merfolk were even in residence, decided to divert their river into a canal system and drain those wetlands for farmland. Now, luckily, most of the family was out at sea visiting relatives, but one poor mermaid had stayed behind and was caught completely unawares, and she got tangled up in the various ropes and whatnot trying to climb the half-completed dam to get to the sea, where she was found, captured, and put in a tub, only to die of shock when she realized she was surrounded by human beings. So, a rather tragic story that I guess you could say talks about the price of development if you're not careful, and perhaps also carries the thought that maybe you should let your neighbors know you exist. That's just me, though. Next, we head north to cold Scandinavia, where there are a lot of mermaid and water spirit stories. Now, there were some variations on merfolk, but generally speaking, the most common ones I found in my sources were the Havman, who is male, and the Havfrau, who is female. The Havman is described as having dark or green hair with a full beard, and sometimes having blue skin. The Havfrau is described as having very light skin and light hair, with occasionally being said to have blue eyes. There's also the Norwegian Marmailer, and there was no pronunciation guide, so if you're Norwegian and I mangled that, I'm sorry. That particular variation of merfolk can, of course, see the future and summon storms. These seem to be common merfolk powers across various cultures. I mean, we saw this in African, Asian, and American mythology as well. I think some of that makes sense, as if you're out to sea or any large body of water in a small boat, you're gonna be worried about weather, but I find the commonalities here interesting. There's also a reoccurring concern over whether or not merfolk can be saved in the Christian sense, and interestingly enough, the older stories seem to firmly come down on, yes, merfolks have souls, and they can be redeemed. For example, a merman confronts a priest about this, and the priest gets all snobby and tells him that it's more likely that his cane will sprout flowers than the Almighty will grant redemption to such a wretched creature. This leaves the poor merman devastated, but the priest doesn't even make a quarter mile before his cane just erupts with flower blossoms. And to the priest's credit, he repents his cruelty and runs back to the mermaid to tell him the good news and offers to convert him on the spot. Which is a good reminder for my fellow Christians here. Don't think yourself so special because you're redeemed. we did nothing to earn that redemption. Also, perhaps remember that cruelty is never pleasing to the Lord. But the rest of you aren't here for a sermon, so I apologize and I'll move on. Speaking of commonalities, there's an obsession with what we'll call romance, in reference to our dread Lord Algorithm's sensibilities, terror be on his name. Denmark, however, gives us something unique in showing us the results of such a romance, however. The story goes that there was a smith named Basmus who went missing for 3 days while at sea. He turns back up claiming he had been lost in a fog the whole time, and he shows up with a boat full of fish, but afterwards he never goes out to sea again. On the flip side, he's also always able to find the best salvage after a storm, which allows him to provide rather well for his young and growing family. 7 years later, though, the truth comes out when a young man who looked 18 appeared at his door and declared himself the son of Bosmus and the local mermaid. I'm not going to get on Bosmus's case here because, frankly, I'm not sure how much choice he would have had in this matter, so let's give the poor man some grace. Now, to his credit, he takes the boy in, whose name is Hans, and Hans eats like 10 men. And this is a problem. In fact, I'm wondering if this is why the boy's mother sent him to dry land in the first place. Hans seems to grasp that this is a problem and tells his father, hey, you don't need to beggar yourself just feeding me, Dad. If you could just make me a good staff of iron, I'll seek my fortune deeper inland. Well, the problem is Hans is so incredibly strong that your standard wrought staff of iron just cracks in his hand, and even the kind of iron rods they used for wagon axles weren't cutting it. So, Basmus and Hans gather all the iron they can find, heat it super hot working together, and forge it into a super dense staff. For those of you screaming that it doesn't work that way, this is a fairy story, just roll with it. Happy with his new staff, Hans thanks his father and heads off to the local squire, who it turns out is terribly short-handed at this time of year. Now, the local squire has only half the work crew he needs to get through the season, so is happy to see Hans, and when Hans says he could do the work of the missing half of the crew as long as he gets the same amount of food that half a work crew would get, the squire agrees. Of course, Hans makes a rather poor impression by sleeping in on his first day and having to have his boss directly wake him up. He then eats a massive breakfast and heads out to thresh grain. Now, back then, they threshed grain by hand using wooden flails, but those were too frail for Hans, who decides to tie 2 wooden beams together with a whole horsehide, and then lift the barn roof off of the barn and set it off to the side to have room to work. And he threshes everything before lunch is even ready. He decides this is worthy of a nap. Hans not only eats a lot, he sleeps a lot. So I don't know if this is due to his strength or the fact that he's only 6 years old. The squire, however, wakes him up from his nap and says, hey, you left the wheat mixed in with the chaff. You're not done. You need to separate this out. Hans goes, you know what? You're right. I'm sorry, boss. Walks into the barn, takes a deep breath, and blows really hard on that massive pile of grain and just blows the chaff clear off the farm. He then looks up and goes, oh yeah, I should clean up after myself, and puts the roof very carefully back on the barn and goes to finish his nap. All of this terrifies the squire, who goes rushing to his wife, and his wife decides what we need to do is kill Hans. Which seems like a terrible overreaction to me. I mean, yes, Hans is super strong, and that's a little worrying, but He's done nothing but what you asked him here to, so jumping straight to murder seems like an overreaction to say the least. Our now villainous duel tries a couple of schemes here. First, they get the workforce to agree to go cut wood in the forest, and they make a big public bet that whoever comes in last will be hung. Now, they of course rigged the game here. First, they make sure that they let Hans sleep in, because we've seen that he's a sleepy guy, and they give him worn-out horses that wouldn't be able to pull a fully loaded cart. This doesn't bother Hans. Now, on the way to the forest, he breaks the gates, and he goes, oh, well, I can't just leave these here. Animals will get out of the forest. So he picks up a big stone and blocks off the gate. This will be important later. He gets there, and, at this point, it's past lunch. Everyone's been working for hours. They got a great lead on him. And Hans's axe breaks. But Hans's is so strong, he's just able to rip trees up out of the ground with his bare hands. So this lead quickly vanishes. And the other woodcutters, not wanting to be hung, rush back as quick as possible, thinking, well, the horses can't pull the cart. Joke's on them. Because Hans just wraps up everything in a rope when he realizes his horses can't pull a fully loaded cart, picks up the cart and wears it like a backpack, and runs back home, leading the horses on a rein. And all these guys are blocked by the giant stone that Hans had put in to gate off the forest. And when he gets there, he's like, what, you guys can't pick up this stone? There's 12 of you. Just reaches out with one hand and throws the stone into the forest and runs into the farm, beating everyone home. When he wakes up the next morning, he's like, so who's getting hung? Everyone goes, what? There's no hanging. It was a joke, Hans. We were joking. And he's like, oh, funny. That's actually more terrifying to me than his strength, the fact that he can laugh off this as a joke. So their second scheme is to send Hans to clean up a stopped up well and to try and kill him by throwing stones on him. But Hans just shakes off the stone and tells him, hey, I think you got some hens kicking down gravel. That's making this a lot harder. Can you shoo the chickens away? And he finishes the job, and everyone's just like, oh my god, what do we do, right? So, in desperation, they send him to a lake known to be haunted by the devil, who apparently in Danish folklore rejoices in the nickname of Old Erik. Now, this isn't unusual. In English, the devil is sometimes referred to as Old Scratch or Old Nick, which I guess makes sense since he's older than the universe, so calling him old, that tracks. Anyways, Hans goes fishing, and Old Erik grabs him and drags him down into the lake. However, as you would expect from the son of a mermaid, Hans doesn't drown. In fact, he turns around and beats the crap out of the devil with the iron staff his father made him, and extorts the devil to give him fish. At this point, the squire is so freaked out, he just tells Hans, you know what, just go to hell and get tribute. And Hans takes this literally, heads south to find hell, trips over a demon rider and forces the rider to take him to hell, kicks in the gates of hell and demands tribute, and poor Old Erik, who's like, haven't I been punished enough for my sins? Why do you do this to me, God? Why am I tormented? And we all know why he's tormented, because he's the evilest being in the universe and he deserves it, but still, gives Erik a pile of gold and silver, as much as he can possibly carry, which is a lot, as long as he promises to just go away. So, Hans shows up to the squire's place like, hey, I went to hell. They're actually very nice and shockingly generous for hell, which terrifies the squire even more, but at this point, Hans is bored of the game. So he splits the wealth between the squire and his father and says, "Here you go, Dad. Listen, I had fun on land, but I'm going back home to Mom." And heads back to the sea to everyone's relief, except perhaps the mermaid, who is now stuck having to try to feed this kid again. But my sympathy for her is limited as she is a creepy kidnapper. Now, a slightly more serious story, and this was one I found like several variations of across Scandinavia, where the names were changed or the events were slightly different, and there's at least one version where the villain is a troll instead of a mermaid. So I am going to try and make note of these variations where I can, but I did have to pick one version to more or less stick with, and I stuck with the southern Swedish version of the story. This is the Swedish story of the prince and Merfolk, who is also called Singora in some versions. Now, the story says there was a king and a queen who were childish, but the queen loved to sail, and one day as she was out sailing, in some versions it's actually the king coming back from a military campaign, the ship was stopped by an unknown force and held fast in the water, with the waves raising about the boat threateningly. And the queen heard a voice from the sea, "Never again shall thou tread on green earth unless you give me what thou bears under your girdle." Now, just in case anyone is unaware, a girdle is a kind of underskirt that was worn as a support and enhancement garment. The queen was unaware that she was pregnant, so she agreed and threw a bunch of keys she was wearing at her belt in the sea, thinking that's what that voice was referring to. Well, she gets to shore, find out she's with child, and even though everyone is celebrating, the queen, being a rather wise woman, immediately cottons on to what the voice really wants and tells her husband, who is concerned but tells her, "Hey, don't worry about this too much. This is a mysterious sea voice. We'll take steps and we will thwart this sea voice." The child was born a healthy baby boy, and the story doesn't name him, so I'm going to name him Gustav, because I can. Reasoning that the voice couldn't take their kid if he simply stayed away from the water, the parents kept him the hell away from the sea. Now, this worked for 12 years until some royal cousins came visiting, and they convinced Gustav to ride down to the beach to play. The minute that horse touched the incoming tide, horse and Gustav were gone, just poof, and he found himself at the bottom of the sea in a golden palace in front of a mermaid, who told him, "Hey, I don't blame your parents for trying, but you're here now, so you're mine. And if you serve me well as a page, I'll let you go home after a while, but if you fail me in even one task, I'ma kill you." This isn't the best employment offer I've ever heard, but sadly, it's also not the worst. Now, interestingly enough, we seem to be back in the underwater realm of dry land here. Although this isn't explicitly said, you can see why I think so later on in the story. After some time, the mermaid calls Gustav in and gives him a job. She hands him 2 bundles of yarn, one black, one white, and tells him to wash the black yarn white and the white yarn black. He freaks out because, well, how? It's at this point that our heroine, Merfolk, shows up, and being a rather lovely girl his own age, offers to help after hearing his problems on 2 conditions. One, he promises to be as faithful to her as she is to him, and to tell no one she helped him. Not having a lot of options, he agrees to the deal. Merfolk promptly summoned forth piercelings, a type of fey-like brownie or other helper spirit, who promptly get the job done for them. In response to seeing this job completed, the mermaid gives Gustav some free time, but eventually calls him back and hands him 2 barrels of wheat and barley mixed together, and tells him to separate the grains out or, die. Once again, Messerina shows up and gets the same promise from Gustav, calls forth her fairy helpers, and gets the job done. The mermaid once again leaves Gustav alone for a bit, and I like to think that maybe he's learning some stuff and getting a bit of an education while he's down there, in between doing impossible tasks, but the story doesn't say. I just like to think that, his time wasn't entirely wasted in this captivity. Well, once again, Gustav is called in and told to clean some stables that haven't been cleaned in 20 years. If he pulls it off, he can not only go home, but the mermaid will give him one of her daughters as a wife. Well, once again, Messerina shows up and tells him, hey, I'll help you out here, but here's some additional information. All the mermaid daughters are the daughters of kings who have been changed into animals. And when you pick one, you need to pick the cat with yellow sides and a cropped ear. Honestly, this sounds to me like not only is the mermaid kidnapping kids and putting them in life-threatening danger, she also kidnaps kings and forces them into romance. Has the Dreadlord algorithm, terribly on his name, forces me to call it. This mermaid gets creepier and more disgusting the more I learn about her, honestly. Well, Gustav presents the newly cleaned stables to the mermaid. She takes him to a room full of animals, and without hesitation he does exactly what he's told, picks up the cat, which is unsurprisingly Messerina enchanted into cat form, and says, yep, this is the girl I want to marry. I'm not marrying anybody else. Thank you very much, ma'am. However, the mermaid isn't done yet and tells Gustav, okay, you got it, but you need to head over to my sister's to get proper clothing for your new bride. Gustav, fearing a trick, because why wouldn't he, runs to his fiancée because, well, she solved all of his problems for him so far, so why stop now? Sure enough, our lovely heroine gives him the instructions and the tools he needs to survive this quest. First telling him, you're gonna come to a creaky old gate. Take this grease and grease it. Next, you'll see a pair of woodsmen trying to chop down trees with wooden axes. Give them these iron axes. After that, you'll see men threshing grain with iron flails. Give them these wooden flails. Lastly, there's a pair of eagles. Feed them this meat. As for the mermaid's sister, she warns Gustav not to eat anything while he's there. So Gustav, not being a complete idiot, follows her instructions, even though the mermaid's sister, a powerful sea witch, tries to force him to eat something 3 times, and 3 times he hides the food before she hands over the clothes and other needed objects for the wedding. When he leaves, the sea witch tries to set the eagles, the men, and the gate on him, but because he helped all of them, the eagles, men, and the gate refuse to harm him and let him pass in peace. So, keep in mind, one good deed often gets another. Gustav and Messerina were married, and the mermaid sent them home on a flying chariot. However, on the way home, they have their first argument over whose father to visit first. Gustav decides to break pattern and not listen to his wife, deciding to go home by himself and meet up with Messerina later. This leaves him vulnerable to a curse that causes him to forget everything when he enters his parents' home. So, his parents are super excited to see him, even though he can't tell them a single thing that happened when he disappeared into the ocean, and after getting him checked up, go, alright, well, you're old enough that it's time for you to get married, let's fix you up with a princess. However, Messerina knew this was coming, and infiltrated the palace as a serving maid. I really feel like this story should be centered on her. Someone should rewrite this, because she's the one who does everything in this story. With the exception of the mermaid sister quest, but even then, she's the one that explains everything. So, when the wedding feast is laid out, Messerina shows up as a serving maid and summons 2 doves. She throws out some grain, and the male bird flies in and eats all the grain, and the female dove screams out that you have treated me like Gustav treated Messerina. And this freaks everyone out at the feast because talking doves. I would be alarmed. But this also breaks the curse, and Gustav, remembering everything, repents, turns around, embraces Messerina, and says, I'm sorry, please come back. And she's happy to do it. So he turns around and introduces his parents to his wife, and the king and the queen, perhaps thinking that upsetting a sorceress, because what else do you call a woman who can do all of this, might be unwise, especially since this sorceress is being incredibly nice about them trying to fix up her husband with another woman, gladly welcome her to the family, and the story ends. And I found this really interesting because this is really an over-elaborate matchmaking scheme on the part of the mermaid at best. And I just really don't see what the mermaid got out of it. But we do see the mermaid here kidnapping people and engaging in sorcery, which are other things we've seen a lot in the various mythologies we've covered. Now, we still have a lot of ground to cover, so let's turn to Estonia, where a mermaid known to be a shapeshifter lived. And she was known for changing into the shapes of different animals to play with children, but these days avoids adults like the plague. This is due to a relationship she had in the dim past with the fourth son of a farmer who barely labored under the nickname Sleepy Tony due to his habit of ducking chores and sleeping late. Sleepy Tony preferred the woods over people and loved to row out in a small boat during rough seas. He was also a very good-looking man and a smooth talker, so he managed to talk a lot of people into supporting him for a while, and eventually struck up a friendship with the mermaid and talked her into marrying him. And she was happy to do it because he was hot and a great talker. And there was a condition. He can't see her on Thursdays. At first, that's fine, and it turns out the mermaid is practically undersea royalty with a palace and beautiful gardens. Yes, we are back to that dry land under the sea, folks. And all the comforts and luxuries he could possibly want. Plus, no work was expected of him other than to stay pretty and entertain his wife 6 nights out of the week. Honestly, sounds like a decent deal. However, he soon finds himself a little torn up about what's going on Thursday night, and he has the sneaking suspicion that his wife might be hiding a boyfriend from him. So he begins to pester her to let him spend Thursday night with her, but she refuses, and nothing she says can absolve his fears. These kind of suspicions are hard to fend off once they take a hold, and Tony isn't the most trusting or the best of people, so he's not really able to resist these suspicions. Eventually, he breaks down and peeks, and sees his wife in a giant tub of water swimming around with a giant fish tail, and it freaks him out. Which I'm not sure why, because he knew she was a mermaid when they met. But the sight of this breaks their marriage contract, and Tony has to go home even though his wife is heartbroken about it. He returns to dry land to find out that decades have passed. We've heard this part of the story before too, haven't we, folks? And unfortunately, his mortal body has aged into infirm old age. After finding out that all of his family has passed away, along with everyone else he knew, he tells his story to the assembled listeners at his father's own farm and promptly passes away. And ever since then, the mermaid has avoided contact with adult human beings, perhaps still heartbroken. We leave our Estonian mermaid to her grieving, and we head over to the Czech Republic, where we have another soul prison story. This does seem to be a uniquely European element, where we have mermaid and mermaid-like creatures capturing human souls and keeping them in vessels. In this case, the story is about a lady named Lidoshka, who is washing her clothes but is constantly harassed by a bullfrog until she promises to be the godmother of the frog's kids. She of course forgets about this promise, because how likely is a frog to show up and demand you keep your promises? Well, in this case, that happens. The frog shows up and goes, "Hey, you need to meet your godchildren." And a promise is a promise, so Lidoshka heads over to the underwater realm, where she is led to a house made of crystal water and meets her godchildren, and they in turn are so delighted by her that they become very fast friends, but they tell her to avoid their father, a giant frog mer person thing, because he likes to capture human souls and keep them in upside down jars. Now, Lidoshka is a good Christian woman, and she can't leave souls in bondage like that. So she convinces her godchildren to tell her where the souls are being kept. And she promptly flips over every jar, freeing the souls. Now, unlike the last story I told with Jack, in this case the souls turn into doves upon being freed and disappear through the walls, so Lidoshka knows these souls are free. And the kids warn her, "Hey, Daddy's home," so she runs for it, and that's the end of the story. My sources mentioned another variant, but didn't give me the full version, involving a mother seeking her lost son's soul, with our merfrog guy living in a silver palace that can only be accessed through a pool. If anyone can point me to the full story on that, I would be grateful, because that sounds interesting. For our last story, we head to Poland and the city of Warsaw. And I know it's like 300 miles from the ocean, but according to legend, this city was founded by an active mermaid. According to some sources, the mermaid is the twin sister of the Little Mermaid of Hans Christiansen's story, which, for you Disney fans, means Ariel had a cooler twin sister we never heard about. In fact, there are several versions of this story, and I'm going to try and cover the ones I could find in some detail here. The first one is about a prince named Casimir who went hunting in a swamp and got lost. A mermaid shows up and leads him to safety, firing burning arrows in the night that he can follow to dry land. And once he gets into dry land, he is so grateful he founds a city on the spot. This seems kind of random to me, so I'm wondering if there's anything else to this story. Like, did Casimir and the mermaid know each other beforehand? The story doesn't really say. I told this story to one of my patrons, and he suggested, this really sounds like the mermaid trying to get rid of an ex by giving him something to do. And I kind of like that headcanon, honestly. But moving on. Another story has the mermaid showing up when there was already a settlement on the site of Warsaw, and repeatedly fouling the fishermen's nets and releasing fish. But once they heard her singing, the fishermen fell in love with her voice and forgave her. That power of her mermaid song, right? A rich merchant decided to catch her, looking to profit from her singing, and this enraged the fishermen, who took up arms in her defense and freed her. In gratitude, she promised to defend the city always. The last one is the wildest one. So, back in elder days, the city was defended by a griffin. And I love griffins, so bonus points right there. And as part of his duties, he would accompany fishermen from Warsaw to the Baltic to look after them. And while on the Baltic, he met the mermaid in question, and they fell in love. I have no idea how a relationship between a mermaid and a griffin is supposed to work, but you know what? I'm not going to judge. If they're happy, it's none of my business, right? However, the Swedes invaded Poland, and this happened more than once, and the Griffin was mortally wounded in the invasion and died. Enraged, the mermaid picked up arms and in the Griffin's place chased out the Swedes. And the people of Warsaw were so moved by this that they placed her on the coat of arms for the city. So, if you're ever in Warsaw and you wonder why there are so many mermaid statues everywhere, well, now you know. With that, let me say thank you for listening, and I hope you found this video informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, comment, or even subscribe. All of these help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord Algorithm. Terror be on his name. I'm sorry to say I had to leave some stories out for lack of space and time, but I'm hoping to record them at a later date, and I probably will be releasing them at least to my patrons. If you're interested in those stories, once again, you can join for $1 a month, links in the description. We are arriving towards the end of our Mermaid World Tour here. There's one more video for Europe, and then I'll be talking about twin-tailed mermaids. They're going to get their own video. A special video about octopus mermaids like Ursula from The Little Mermaid. We're going to talk about deep ones, and hopefully a brief series on the various not mermaids that didn't make it into these videos, such as the finned ones and the various stories of the Queen of the Sea from China. We'll be wrapping up mermaids by looking at mermaids in popular culture after that. I hope you all stick with me, but until then, look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, keep reading.